Hello, and welcome to this lecture about photosynthesis. By the end of this section, you're going to be able to summarize the actual process of photosynthesis, explain the relevance of photosynthesis to other living organisms, identify the reactants and products of photosynthesis, and describe the main structures involved in each of the stages of photosynthesis. Okay? First things first, you might want to ask yourself, why is photosynthesis important? Okay, it has a lot to do with how we are able to survive on this earth. First of all living organisms are made up of cells. Well, all cells need some sort of chemical energy to maintain themselves. That energy can be broken down by cellular respiration, and the carbohydrate they break down is glucose. Well, where does glucose come from? That's where photosynthesis comes into play. Photosynthesis is the actual chemical reaction that allows for glucose molecules and other sugars to be created. The overall reaction of photosynthesis is 6 carbon dioxide molecules plus 6 water molecules, and with light energy added, usually coming directly from the sun and acting on the chlorophyll of the plant, that will allow us to create glucose molecule and some 6 oxygen molecules. You will want to know this entire overall reaction of photosynthesis. This is something you are going to want to memorize. So an easy way to remember this is, think about it. Plants are going to basically take up what we give out. So when we breathe in fresh oxygen, and we also have to use glucose to break down our food and create energy or chemical energy in our bonds. So this is what the plants give us. What do we give back to the plants? Well, when we undergo cellular respiration, what do you do when you exhale? You're actually exhaling carbon dioxide. So that's what the plants are going to be using, along with water and some light energy, usually, like I said, from the sun, to create and go back through their photosynthesis cycle to create more oxygen for us to breathe and more glucose molecules as well. Sunlight is the main overall energy source for these autotrophs. Auto meaning self or automatic, troph meaning feeder. So an autotroph is an organism that can produce their own food. A good example of this obviously are plants, but then also some autotrophs to mention are bacteria and algae. Heterotrophs, on the other hand, hetero meaning other and feeder, of course, by meaning troph. These are going to be the organisms that actually have to consume something else to get their energy. So, of course, what do? We have to eat plants or food full of glucose molecules, things of that nature, to get our energy. But also animals do the exact same thing. This is a picture of the electromagnetic spectrum, which you can look up online, or you even have pictures of in your textbook. Okay, this little tiny portion right here, this little slit, is actually where visible light falls into play. Each of the different colors that we see in the spectrum all are able to absorb light in a different wavelength. So violets are going to be appearing when we have 400 nanometer wavelength versus 700 nanometer wavelength is going to be our darkish red color. Now, one thing to notice here is the wavelength definition. The distance between the crests of 2 successive waves of light in nanometers, and that's basically what a wavelength is. The shorter the wavelength means the greater the energy, and that's important to know. So this one right here, and from crest to crest, they mean this little peak right here, this crest, to this crest on the orange line if we're looking at that. So from here to here, it is a very long wavelength, which means it's actually a low amount of energy there and available. You can follow along here as we go higher, the greater amount of energy. So over here in this violet colored line, obviously from crest to crest right here, we have a very short wavelength, but that means we have a greater amount of energy. So once again, the shorter the wavelength, the greater amount of energy. The longer the wavelength, the less energy that actual color can absorb wavelengths in. Pay attention also to this spectrum up here because this is also showing you the shortest wavelengths that there are, and that's going to be what we use for our X-rays and our UV radiations versus our very, very long wavelengths, which is once again obviously the lowest energy, such as our microwaves and our radio waves. Plants have many, many different pigments because obviously the more plant pigments that a plant has, the greater the range of light energy that plant can absorb. So a pigment, you want to know this definition, is an organic molecule that selectively absorbs light of specific wavelengths. So what are we looking at over here? This is actually the absorbency spectrum, and this right here is their wavelength. So let's take a look first at chlorophyll, let's say A. So chlorophyll A, as we can tell, at around, let's say 450 nanometers, gets very, very highly absorbed by that pigment, meaning that the light is used a lot at this wavelength for chlorophyll A, okay? And remember, if you recall, the color of about 400, 450 was a violet bluish, okay? Then all of a sudden at around 500 to about 680, the wavelengths are not really, really greatly absorbed, which means they would be reflected. And last but not least, around 690 to 700 wavelength or nanometers, once again, the chlorophyll A can go ahead and absorb that light energy to use it for photosynthesis. So chlorophyll A, what it's actually doing is it's absorbing light in the blue-violet area, and it's absorbing light in the reddish area, reddish-orange area. What it's doing is reflecting back the green light because it cannot absorb it at that wavelength. So chlorophyll A is the main major pigment in green plants. And guess what? Since it cannot go ahead and absorb green coloring because of the wavelength, that's why we see plant leaves as green. It's not actually because they're the color of green. It's actually because that green light cannot be absorbed. So that's what we see with our eyes themselves. Another thing to notice here is the accessory pigments. And these accessory pigments, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is anthocyanin and xanthophylls. These are pretty much accessory pigments that maximize the range of other colors in a plant. So right here is a picture of chlorophyll A, which is what we just mentioned. So chlorophyll A can absorb at the blues, and it can also absorb at this orangish red color, but it cannot absorb at this green yellowish color, which is why, once again, that's why we see the color of plants as green. Most plants will use a combination of different pigments because they want to be able to absorb as much light as they can, not just in the blue and the reds, but they want to be able to absorb a variety of different colors because that means the more energy they can actually absorb, the more photosynthesis that they can undergo. In the fall, what happens, and I bet you've wondered once before, is why do the leaves turn different colors? I mean, Miss Johnson, we have green leaves. So what happens with that reflecting green color during the fall? Well, what's happening is the pigment that we're looking at that's actually showing us back and reflecting back the green color, that pigment chlorophyll A is found in the plant's chlorophyll. Well, chlorophyll gets broken down during the fall. And so when that gets broken down, which we can see in this first picture right here at the beginning part, all this chlorophyll is getting broken down. Well, guess what? Now those accessory pigments are able to be seen back here. Those reds, oranges, and all those beautiful fall colors. These are some major photosynthetic pigments for you all to know and understand before the exam. Okay. Chlorophyll A is probably the most important one for you to understand. Chlorophyll A is the primary photosynthetic pigment because, as we saw, chlorophyll A actually reflects back the green color that we see majority of plants have. Okay, it appears green, but remember, it's going to be absorbing, as you can see in this little spectrum, so it's absorbing these violet blues, and it also absorbs these reddish colors. So that's why we reflect back this green in the middle. So that's the chlorophyll A. The other photosynthetic pigments for you to know are labeled right here and actually even bolded out in this section. So right here, the second, some of the accessory pigments you want to know, as mentioned, is going to be our, right here, carotenoids and our xanthophylls. Keratin, you know what color it reflects because it sounds just like the color of carrots. It's going to reflect back that orangish yellow color. Xanthophylls are going to be appearing very, very yellow. And then our chlorophyll B, okay, right here, our chlorophyll B is going to be appearing yellowish green. But the most common one, and the one that we call our major photosynthetic pigment, remember, is going to be chlorophyll A. If you hear anything about anthocyanin pigments, what that is these are pigments that are not directly involved with photosynthesis. In contrary, what these guys do is they give plants a really, really vibrant, beautiful color, and this color, like such as this nice, bright, reddish color, or this violet, what that's doing, that's actually not allowing for a lot of light energy to be absorbed for any means of photosynthesis. But what this does instead is it actually attracts bees and other insects and other pollinators to come eat their nice nectar so they can go ahead and pollinate other plants around them. So as we discussed before, photosynthesis is going to begin when light is absorbed by chloroplasts, and these chloroplasts in plants are actually found inside the mesophyll layer, which you can see right here. There's two layers of mesophyll. There's a palisade mesophyll. This is the part that actually contains those chloroplasts, but then there's also the spongy mesophyll. This spongy layer you're going to be able to find at the lower part of the leaf, so the underside of the leaf, and we know it's the underside because this is usually where stomata are found. Stomata are just kind of like little guard cells that allow carbon dioxide in and oxygen out when photosynthesis is doing what it's supposed to be doing. So these guys, I kind of like to think of them as the bodyguards of the plant cell. So parts of the plant you're going to know as well. So what we just discussed was the mesophyll layer. Remember, there's two mesophyll layers, but they're still both called mesophyll, and they both contain chloroplasts within them right here. The bottom part of the leaf, so if you ever looked at a leaf and looked at the bottom part under a microscope, you'll actually see one side, what I just mentioned a little while ago, which is stomata. These are exactly what the plant knows to do when to allow carbon dioxide in and oxygen out as photosynthesis is occurring. Once again, these are stomata, which are actually two guard cells. They're kind of like bodyguards. They allow things in and out of the plant as needed. So let's go ahead and also point out some other features or parts of a plant as well. First things first, we have a cell wall. The cell wall is on the outside of the plasma membrane. We have a central vacuole right here. The chloroplasts are right here, which we'll get into more detail about in a second. The nucleus is right over here. The cytoplasm is all the gelatinous-like fluid inside the cell except for the nucleus. And then we have the mitochondria, which we right here. That's where actual cellular respiration or ATP is created. Ribosomes, they're kind of floating around, especially on the rough endoplasmic reticulum, and those are providing us for proteins. Plasma membrane, like I said, is on the inside of the cell wall. And then this is the actual chloroplast right here that we're going to be looking at. So the chloroplast, which is this guy right here, these guys contain different stacks of thylakoids. So each one of these little pancake-looking things are a thylakoid. The stroma is all the liquid around these stacks. So you want to know all of these different terms and their definitions. So we just said this is a chloroplast, and chloroplast, another thing to mention is it is double membrane. So we have an outer membrane and we have an inner membrane. Like I said, these are stacks of thylakoid. So this is one thylakoid up top. Then there's another thylakoid. A granum, which is labeled right here, is a stack of these guys. So a stack of thylakoid is a granum. If you're talking about multiple stacks, so let's say this stack and this stack, that's called a grana. Once again, the stroma is the liquid on the inside. And the lumen is the space in between the thylakoids. You can say this is the thylakoid space or the lumen, the actual space in between each of these pancakes, that little red coloring. This is a nice labeled picture, which you will see this model in lab. So it's good to actually be able to identify and look at it now. But also, you might be looking at a slide of chloroplasts in a leaf. And it's be really cool and very interesting because you'll actually see these little chloroplasts moving around and moving around. Depending on what kind of solution you have them in, they'll look a little different. But ultimately, these are the chloroplasts moving in the plant cell. They'll start moving because under a microscope, you're actually forcing photosynthesis to occur because of the light that you're actually shining on them. So it's really neat, very interesting. So what's happening in this picture to my left? So what happens is roots and the root hairs are able to absorb and take in that water from the soil. It goes up through the xylem of the actual plant all the way till it gets and reaches the leaves of the plant. Because remember, there's carbon dioxide in the air, which the plant uses for photosynthesis, but it also needs light energy from the sun, and then here's where it's getting its water from. And those are all the three components or reactants you need for photosynthesis to occur. So remember, these stomata or the guard cells are on the bottom part of the leaf. So during dry conditions, plants are actually able to close those guys up because they don't want to continue to allow transpiration to occur, which is that loss of that water, because they need the water for photosynthesis. And here's a question to think about. Can a plant get carbon dioxide for photosynthesis if the stomata is closed? So if the stomata is closed, can carbon dioxide get in there? The answer is no. With a closed stomata, a plant cannot take in more carbon dioxide. Some plants, such as the C4 and CAM plants, store carbon dioxide in a way that allows them to reduce their dependence on the stomata being open for a constant supply of carbon dioxide. We'll go ahead and end our first part of our photosynthesis lecture there. If you have any questions, email me, and have a great day.